everybody. I hope that you're all doing well. So I'm going to keep it very simple in today's video. I wanted to just do something that didn't require a lot of movement. We're going to do a reading you to sleep video, which I haven't done in over a year maybe, but the reason I wanted to keep it simple is because I don't know if you can tell, but I have a different camera lens today. Normally I film my videos on my little vlog camera that just has a flip up screen, and you know, it's very simple and easy to use and it looks really good. But I was curious, and so I bought a new lens for my old camera that I used to use, my big Canon DSLR. Oh, I hope I said that right. Camera. So my setup is very different, but the lens is amazing. I think it's a little too advanced for me. It is a fixed lens, so what that means is I cannot zoom in or out. That is fixed. And if you guys saw like how far away I am from my camera right now, you would probably laugh. I am so far away, and yet it is so close to my face. But the reason I bought this fixed lens is because I wanted to see if I could find a lens with a more shallow depth of focus, which is why my background looks a little fuzzier than it normally does, which is kind of the look that I wanted. And so I know this lens is mostly meant for photography, you know, photographers and all that, but I was like, I want to see if I can use it for filming videos, and so this is the final outcome. My only thing with this is because I am so far away from the camera, if I wanted to like show you something up close or like focus in on it, I can't do that with this camera. Like I said, I can't zoom in or out. I can't even touch the camera. There's no way. I'm probably 6 feet away from my camera right now. So I'm definitely not going to use this camera in every single video. The setup for this is a lot. I'm also standing right now, which I never stand in my videos, but I put my Blue Yeti back on its floor tripod and I brought it all the way up so that it's close to my height. So it's a little weird, but if I like the way it looks and if you guys like the way it looks, then I'll definitely be using it more, but it will not be for every video. I'm in the same room. I know you guys really like this, like the aesthetic in this room, like the colors and stuff and how it's brighter, which I'm glad you guys like it. I like it too. That's why I always film in here now. So I'll go back and forth between this and my vlog camera where I sit on the floor and all that. So let me know your thoughts. I'm looking at it. My viewfinder is on my computer, which is way over there. So if you see me looking down there, that's why. I'm just checking to make sure that everything is good because I'm not used to being this far away. But anyway, I'm going to do another reading you to sleep video where I read you a book. About 2 years ago, if you've been with me for a while, you know I did this as a series where I read Dear John, and then I never finished it, so that's why I was hesitant to start, like, to do another reading you to sleep series, because I don't want to make it a series. First of all, I don't think you're supposed to read a whole book on YouTube. I don't know if you can actually get in trouble for that or what, copyright wise. And then also, those videos don't really do as well, if I'm being very honest with you, so that's why I was hesitant to do another one. But I'm gonna read you the first chapter. We'll see how long it takes of this book. I just finished it like a week or two ago. If you're looking for a book to read, I suggest it. This was my first time reading for fun. I don't even know. It was probably my first time reading a book since college, which was 3 years ago. So I don't know what possessed me to pick up a book and read it, but I did. I'm so glad I did. It's a small book. It's decently thick, but I went through it in just a couple of days. So it's called Accidental Heroes by Danielle Steele, who is a #1 New York Times bestseller, apparently. I'm trying to look so you can kind of see the book because it's with me, so it's focused. But if I were to like hold it over here, well, anyway, I'm just thinking out loud. But I'm just gonna read the beginning. We'll see how far we go. I would recommend, if you could find this book, I'd say read it. If you can find like a cheap version online too, I'd recommend it. It was literally one of those books, I'm not even kidding. I read it and I was like multiple times throughout the book. I'm not even kidding. So anyway, actually, should I read you the synopsis? I'll read you the synopsis first so you know what you're getting into. So it's called Accidental Heroes. It says, a decorated former Air Force pilot, widowed with 3 children after her husband's savage death in Iraq, a pregnant flight attendant, a dedicated TSA agent, a major film star, an off-duty pilot who has just lost his 40-year career, a distraught father traveling with the baby son he has abducted from his estranged wife. Their fates and those of many others converge on a beautiful May morning at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport as 2 planes depart for San Francisco. At a security checkpoint, TSA agent Bernice Adams finds a postcard bearing an ambiguous, perhaps ominous, message. When Homeland Security agent Ben Waterman arrives, he too is concerned. Sifting through data and relying on instinct, Ben becomes convinced that someone on senior pilot Helen Smith's plane is planning something terrible. And he's right. As the jet bears down on its destination of San Francisco, strangers are united, desperate choices are made, and futures will be changed forever by a handful of accidental heroes. It's so good. Oh, okay. It literally was like reading a movie, if that makes sense. Like, I had assigned actors in my head of like who played the characters and everything. It was so good. Okay, anyway. Chapter 1. So the first couple of chapters are basically just introducing the characters because there are a bunch of different stories that come together. So it's not going to get into anything too juicy yet. But, alright. Chapter 1. Bernice Adams woke up, as she usually did, just before the alarm went off, so she didn't wake her 6-year-old son, Toby. Some maternal instinct pulled her out of her dreams before the buzzer sounded. She smiled as she looked at him sleeping next to her in the queen-sized bed that had been a lucky find in a second-hand furniture store. She'd bought a new mattress for it that they had tried out together, and Toby said it felt like a cloud. It was a stretch for their budget, but she decided it was worth it. Toby needed to get to school rested so he could pay attention and do well. She wanted him to have every advantage she could give him. She had managed to furnish the small 1-bedroom apartment with hand-me-down furniture and what she found on the sidewalk on Tuesday nights when people left out big furniture items they didn't want for garbage pickup the next morning. It was always a treasure hunt. She had found her night tables that way, a blue dresser, and the kitchen table they ate on every day. The formica was chipped around the edges, but the bright red looked cheerful in their tiny kitchen, barely big enough for her to cook in. She had painted the walls and some of the furnishings herself, and found the living room rug at Goodwill. All put together, it looked homey and cozy, and she had framed the Spider-Man posters Toby loved for their bedroom, and there was one of Batman and Robin over their bed. Bernice was a single mother. Toby's father had taken off when she got pregnant at 19. She'd been working as a waitress by day and going to City College of New York by night. She hadn't seen him since, although she'd heard that he was married now and had 3 other children. She wanted no contact with him. He'd been a smooth talker. She'd fallen for him, and the pregnancy was an accident. He had disappeared as fast as he could. She'd had Toby when she was 20 and had managed parenthood on her own ever since. Bernice was a survivor. More than that, she wanted to make something of herself and set an example for her son, to show him that he didn't have to be limited by the world he was born into, and with an education he could have a good job and a good life one day. It was what she aspired to herself. She'd been raised in foster homes after her parents died when she was in her early teens. Some of the homes were awful, and some of them were okay, but she was determined that nothing like it would ever happen to her boy. Bernice's only relative, her brother Clive, had been in and out of prison for a dozen years since he turned 18 for credit card fraud, grand theft auto, and drug dealing, all the means of making a living he had learned on the streets. She hadn't seen him since she was 16 and he was 20, fresh out of prison, on parole. She didn't want to see him again, and he knew nothing about his nephew. Clive wasn't an evil man, and he'd been nice to her, and to the best of his ability. He just didn't know how to get out of the trap he had grown up in. She wanted her life and her son's to be different. The building they lived in was clean, and lived in by respectable families on 125th Street. It had been built in the 1930s and must have been beautiful then. What had once been spacious, handsome apartments had been broken into small ones for low rents. Now it was shabby, and the people who had lived there and could had moved downtown. Other buildings near her had been renovated, and parts of her neighborhood were slowly becoming gentrified. She'd been fortunate to find an apartment she could afford on her salary. She managed to get by and take care of her son. After graduating from City College, she had worked for TSA security at JFK International Airport for the past 5 years, checking passengers as they came through the lines, observing them keenly, directing them to the body scan machines, and doing pat-downs when instructed to do so. She was also enrolled in law school online. In Bernice's mind, the secret to everything was education and hard work, and no one was going to cheat her of that. She reminded Toby of it every day, whenever she could. She hated to leave his small, warm body curled up against her back as she got out of bed and headed to the shower to get ready for work. When she left at 4 o'clock, she would leave him with her neighbor, who would take him to school with her own children. Bernice worked a 5:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. shift, like mine, almost, kind of, which gave her just enough time to pick Toby up at school herself and be with him for the rest of the day. She taught him the extra lessons he didn't have at school yet, and then did her own homework for law school after she made dinner and put him to bed. She tried to be asleep by 9:30 or 10, since she had to get up at 3:30 to get ready for work. She ate breakfast on the train to save time. She didn't go out with friends and hadn't been to a movie in years. Her whole life was her son, her job, and her studies, so that one day they'd have more than that, and he would have a real future. They talked about it a lot, even though he was only 6. She talked to him like an adult and told him she was going to be a lawyer and work in a law firm downtown when she graduated. That was her dream, and dreams become realities if you worked hard enough to achieve them. She said it to Toby almost like a mantra. She showered, had a cup of coffee, and put on her uniform. Bernice was She hadn't had a serious date in years, or even a casual one in the last 2. There would be plenty of time for that, she told herself, when she had a better job after law school. She didn't love working for TSA, but it paid the rent and bought their food and gave her the time she needed to study for her law classes. Her schedule was good for her. When she was dressed, she rolled Toby, still asleep, into his Spider-Man sleeping bag, carried him to the neighbors, and knocked. She didn't ring the bell, so she wouldn't wake the other children. They didn't have to be in school until 8 o'clock. Toby woke up in his mother's arms just before the door opened. "Why do we have to get up so early?" he complained, burrowing against her and closing his eyes again. It was dark outside and would be for several more hours. Because I have to go to work and do my job," she said, kissing his forehead. "And you have to go to school so that one day you can have a good job too, like a doctor or a lawyer," she added, programming him early. "I want to be a policeman," he grumbled as the door opened, and their neighbor took him in her arms and smiled at Bernice. She knew what a good mother she was and admired her for it. Toby was almost back to being asleep as Bernice handed him off. He had a few more hours to doze before he had to get up, have breakfast, and get dressed for school. "Have a nice day," their neighbor whispered, and gently closed the door. She took Toby in every morning for free, as a favor to Toby's mother. On weekend nights, Bernice often babysat her 2 children in exchange and let them sleep on her couch or in the bed with Toby, and slept on the couch herself if their mother had a big date. They did what they could to help each other, 2 women alone with their children. The neighbor had a son and a daughter close to Toby's age, and the 3 children were best friends, which worked well too. It was a beautiful May morning as Bernice left the building, and she thought of the church day camp she had rolled Toby in for the summer. There would be lots of things for him to do there. She had saved enough money to pay for it by skipping lunch for 5 months. The money was in her bank account now, and they had already accepted him. Bernice rushed to catch the first train she took to work every day, and arrived at the airport right on time. She put her purse in her locker and reported for duty at JFK Airport on the dot at 5:30 a.m. She didn't love her job, but it was a good means to an end, and she reminded herself daily that it wouldn't be forever. Once she graduated from law school, she'd have a better opportunity and could look for a job in a law firm, even as a paralegal, until she passed the bar. But for now, her daily work life was rife with petty jealousies, unpleasant supervisors, and angry passengers who didn't want to take their shoes off and complained when Bernice had to go through their bags looking for computers or liquids, or because of something they'd seen on the x-ray, like a can of dog food or a suspicious object, which in most cases turned out to be nothing when they checked. They were trained to look for weapons, materials that could be combined to create explosives, or whatever seemed suspicious on the x-ray machine. Her current supervisor, Denise Washington, was particularly disagreeable, and it was obvious that she disliked Bernice and everything she stood for. Bernice was too clean-cut and too straight-arrow, and had made the mistake of casually saying one day that she was going through law school online. Denise had been scornful and angry towards her ever since. She hated girls like Bernice who talked about their bright future as though it were something they could just pluck off of a tree. Denise knew better. She had been passed over for promotions for years, and she didn't even care why anymore. In her mind, she was always getting screwed over by some ambitious young woman like Bernice, desperate to get ahead, whatever it took. She was fed up with women like her, had singled Bernice out years before, and treated her with contempt. Bernice had thought of complaining to Denise's superior, but knew it wouldn't do any good, and she was sure it would make things worse. Denise was angry, an angry, bitter woman. She talked about Bernice behind her back, just loud enough for her to hear. She hated her job and had never done anything to try to change it. She took out her resentment and frustrations on the people she supervised. Bernice was used to the snide remarks and overt insults, and Denise's obvious disapproval of her. She was jealous of Bernice, although she could have done the same things herself had she any interest. Bernice took her assigned spot in the security area, while Denise glared at her as usual. Bernice turned her attention to the early passengers heading for their flights, putting but she might have been mistaken. The woman was older than Bernice would have expected, and with oversized dark glasses which made her hard to recognize. She was pleasant to everyone, and was dressed simply in blue jeans and a sweater. She wasn't glamorous, but seemed like a nice person as Bernice watched her. It was one of those things she liked about her job. You never knew who you would see or what to expect on any given day. It was a pleasant distraction and made putting up with her nasty supervisor easier to bear. Helen Smith woke up at 4:30 to give herself time to shower and dress, have coffee, and be fully awake by the time she and the others left the Midtown Hotel, where the flight crews of their airline stayed in New York. There was no traffic at that hour, so they could leave the hotel at 5:30 in the van that came to get them and be at the airport at 6:30. And there would be little for Helen to attend to once they got there. The airline planned the routes for them and checked the weather. All she and the rest of the flight crew had to do was make sure that everything was mechanically in order once they were on the plane before they took off. Helen had had a distinguished career as a pilot, and after years as an Air Force flight pilot, she had been flying for the airline for 2 years. They had been the hardest years of her life. She had a text when she woke up informing her of an equipment change, the second one relating to this flight back to San Francisco. The day before, she had been notified that she'd been flying an Airbus A330 they had on the ground in New York after a flight from London because it needed to get to San Francisco for a flight to Tokyo. The largest Airbus, the A380, didn't normally fly between San Francisco and New York, but she was checked out for it and was looking forward to flying it. During the night, they had discovered a mechanical problem on the I don't know why I can't say this, A380, and couldn't use it for the San Francisco flight after all. They had almost 300 passengers booked for the flight, and had decided to use a new, smaller Airbus A321 for the 8 a.m. to San Francisco, and a Boeing 757 they had available for the overflow, which would take off at 8:20, so the passengers would be happy, could stick to their schedules, and no one would get bumped due to the change of equipment. It meant they needed a second crew for the 757. Helen had been assigned the A321, which was a plane she liked to fly. It was small and easy to maneuver, and the crews liked the aircraft too. The text message she received said that she would be flying with the San Francisco crew returning to home base as planned. The only change was of the co-pilot, Jason Andrews, whom she didn't know. They informed her that Captain Connor Gray would be flying deadhead, which meant he'd be flying as a courtesy passenger. He would be traveling in the cockpit with her since the flight was full and every passenger seat was sold. The text said only that he had been deactivated and retired due to a medical incident on the ground after his flight to New York 2 days before. The formalities of his retirement would happen in the coming days, but he was no longer cleared to fly, and after the incident, he wouldn't be again. The airline and the FAA were strict about grave medical issues. She'd heard of him as one of the airline's senior pilots, but they had never met. He was close to retirement age, though maybe not quite there yet, and whatever had occurred must have been serious for them to deactivate and retire him, similarly halfway through a trip. She thought about it and hoped to make his return to home base as pleasant as possible under the circumstances. Flying with an unfamiliar co-pilot was standard fare for any commercial pilot since the crews were varied and interchangeable. It made no difference to her. Some were easy to get along with, others were less pleasant, but all were skilled pilots on the first-rate airline she worked for. She flew the plane as she was given to fly, just like in the military, and after years of training and experience, she could fly anything they handed her with her eyes closed. She loved her job. Flying was in her blood. Her father had been an Air Force pilot and retired as a full colonel. Helen had been a fighter pilot for the Air Force in Iraq for several years. She and her husband had both served there, and they had decided that she would leave the Air Force and return to civilian life before his last tour ended. They both had offers from commercial airlines, and for the sake of their children, thought it was time to muster out. It had been a big adjustment for her. She had grown up in the military, and everything about civilian life was unfamiliar to her. It was difficult at first with her husband still in the Air Force. He had been killed 4 months after she left, 8 weeks before he was due to fly home. She wasn't bitter about what had happened to him. He'd been shot down and taken prisoner, and he and all of his crew were killed in an incident that had received press and cries of outrage from the world. He had been decorated posthumously by the president, and the medal he'd been given was on their mantelpiece, where she and her children lived, less than an hour outside San Francisco, in a small, slightly dilapidated house. She had been in shock over her husband's death at first, and it had been unreal quality to it. They both knew the risks, but she never expected it to happen to him, and she had no idea how to manage civilian life without him. She had thought about re-enlisting after he died and going back to the only life she knew in the Air Force, but it wouldn't be fair to the children. They had wanted them to experience life outside the military, but not without their father. That had never been the plan. Her own father had done everything he could to help her, and stayed with the kids when she was away. A year and a half later, she was still adjusting to civilian life without Jack. It hadn't been easy for her or the kids. It was much harder than she expected, and infinitely more so as a widow. She was 42 years old, and the Air Force and military life were second nature to her. There was some resistance to her being a female pilot with the airline, but others had broken down that barrier before her, and most of the men she flew with respected her for her flying record, particularly those who knew of her tours of duty in Iraq. Flying Airbuses between San Francisco and New York, or internationally, was a piece of cake. She had 5 days off coming to her when she got back to San Francisco, and had promised to take all 3 of her children camping. They were just a regular family now, or tried to be, with 2 sons in middle school and a 7-year-old daughter, even though their father had been a war hero and their mother had been a fighter pilot. Helen hadn't made many friends in the community yet. She had little in common with the other mothers she'd met at school, and she kept to herself or spent her time off with her children. She had to be mother and father to them now, which was double the work with 2 boys in Little League and a daughter in Girl Scouts and taking hip-hop dance lessons after school. Helen questioned her decision often about leaving the military. There were times when she missed it desperately. It had been like leaving the womb. Everything about civilian life had been a shock at first. She had found that the only time she was comfortable in her own skin and felt like she knew what she was doing was when she was flying. The rest of the time, she felt like a fish out of water. She hadn't learned to be a civilian yet, but she was trying. She was living day by day. What had happened to Jack had taught her that you couldn't count on the future or on anything. Life was a game of chance. She had nothing and no one to believe in now, except herself. And there were times when she felt like she wasn't enough for her kids. The boys especially needed their father, and all she could do now was her best, which wasn't always enough. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop it there. That is the introduction of, I would say, the 2 main characters, the 2 of the most important characters, the pilot and the TSA agent. And now it goes into like the flight attendants and a couple of the passengers. So that is all I'm going to read for this video. Seriously, I recommend this book if you can find it. Again, it's called Accidental Heroes by Danielle Steele. That's what it looks like. And it's really good if you can get your hands on a copy. Maybe down the line I'll read like a chapter in the middle if you guys don't really care about spoilers. Like the juicy stuff, I can maybe read the chapter where like the ish goes down. But that'll be later down the road, so just let me know. But I definitely don't think I'm gonna read the whole book, but that's okay. Maybe I'll read more on my Patreon. Link in description. I'll figure it out. I don't know. But I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. It was a good excuse for me to be able to play with this camera lens. I am excited to use it more often. Let me know what you guys thought, and I will see you in my next video.